I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. People I am in love. His name is Kandiaronk, and that translates to the muskrat, or la rat, as he was called by the French. In 1703, a soldier named Lahontan wrote down his conversations with him and called it Curious Dialogues with a Savage of Good Sense Who Has Traveled. In them, Kandiaronk gives his impressions of Montreal, New York, and Paris. He talks about being a rational skeptic of Christianity and gives an indigenous critique of European mores on politics, economics, and sexuality. That made Lahontan into somewhat of a celebrity, but it also made Kandiaronk's ideas widespread and very influential in Europe during the time we call the Enlightenment. The late anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist Graeber Wengrow have written about Kandiaronk in their book, The Dawn of Everything. Now, David Graeber's original hefty tome, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, changed everything that I thought I knew about money and was the foundational work for my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. In their new volume, what they talk about is how people have always, throughout prehistory, invented and reinvented their social structures. They talk about how women were vitally involved in leadership and that the rate of innovation paralleled the involvement of women. They also talk about 3 essential freedoms that people took for granted before civilization put an end to all that. And then they end by asking, why is it that people have stopped believing that they can change their social structures? What they write is, the ultimate question of human history, as we'll see, is not our equal access to material resources, land, calories, means of production, much though these things are obviously important, but our equal capacity to contribute to decisions about how to live together. We are projects of collective self-creation. What if we approached human history that way? What if we treat people from the beginning as imaginative, intelligent, playful creatures who deserve to be understood as such? What if, instead of telling a story about how our species fell from some idyllic state of equality, we ask how we came to be trapped in such tight conceptual shackles that we can no longer even imagine the possibility of reinventing ourselves? This concept of the idyllic state of grace or equality goes back to Rousseau's idea that people can only live peacefully in tiny tribes of maybe 10 to 12 and maybe network together into Dunbar's magic number of 150. Jared Diamond, who I just learned from the footnotes, actually has his PhD in the physiology of the gallbladder. But hey, I've written a book on economics and I have an almost PhD in the psychology of creativity. So who am I to throw stones? But what Jared wrote in The World Until Yesterday, What We Can Learn from Traditional Societies, is large populations can't function without leaders who make the decisions, executives who carry out the decisions, and bureaucrats who administer the decisions and laws. Alas, for all of you readers who are anarchists and dream of living without any state government, those are the reasons why your dream is unrealistic. You'll have to find some tiny band or tribe willing to accept you, where no one is a stranger and where kings, presidents, and bureaucrats are unnecessary. What the Davids show is that the reverse was true, that you sometimes had large societies who had a leader with great arbitrary power, but without the mechanisms of enforcement, his power was only as far as the arm would reach, which people tended to avoid. Another curious fact I found is that people have always tried to get away from their own families. That when you look at these different villages and clans, they're actually only 10 to 20% people who are related to each other. Otherwise, travel has always been something that people have enjoyed, and finding people other than your own family. Another person who sees civilization as having saved us from ourselves is Steven Pinker, the author of The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. I talk about him in my episode Sex and Power, Battle of the Daves, and how Graeber and Wengrow critique Pinker as cherry-picking an example to fit his theory, which is the Yanomami, or the fierce people. But someone else who I think does the same thing is Chris Hedges, who I think is the Eeyore of sanctimonious political analysis. He has a recent article called The Final Collapse, in which he's visiting the site of Cahokia, a grain state near what's now St. Louis, that existed from 1050 to 1350 CE and peaked at around 15,000 people and 40,000 in the existing satellite towns. Hedges admonishes, this great city, perhaps the greatest in North America at the time, rose, flourished, fell into decline, and was ultimately abandoned. Civilizations die in familiar patterns. They exhaust natural resources. They spawn parasitic elites who plunder and loot the institutions and systems that make a complex society possible. They engage in futile and self-defeating wars, and then the rot sets in. The great urban centers die first, falling into irreversible decay. Central authority unravels. Artistic expression and intellectual inquiry are replaced by a new dark age, the triumph of tawdry spectacle and the celebration of crowd-pleasing imbecility. I tried to do my best divinity school preacher voice to try to really capture Hedges. In his article, he compares Cahokia to St. Louis today and the world, and then quotes Jared Diamond from Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. Just as in the past, countries that are environmentally stressed, overpopulated, or both, become at risk of getting politically stressed and of their governments collapsing. When people are desperate, undernourished, and without hope, they blame their government, which they see as responsible for or unable to solve their problems. They try to emigrate at any cost. They fight each other over land. They kill each other. They start civil wars. They figure that they have nothing to lose, so they become terrorists, or they support or tolerate terrorism. The Daves also write at length about Cahokia, which they say shares with Egypt that kings were buried with thousands of human subjects killed for the occasion. And to archaeologists, that's a reliable indicator that there's a process of state formation underway. But what they found is that whatever Cahokia represented in the eyes of those under its sway, it seems to have ended up being overwhelmingly and resoundingly rejected by the vast majority of its people. For centuries after its demise, the site where the city once stood and hundreds of miles of river valleys around it lay devoid of human habitation, a vacant quarter, a place of ruins and bitter memories. So how did Cahokia end? The people just walked away. They defected. They started little tribal republics that were in careful ecological balance with the natural environment, which brings up what the Daves call the 3 essential freedoms. 1, to move away, 2, to disobey, and 3, to build new social worlds. So the Daves see the first 2 as scaffolding for the third, but they also show how the phrase to move to a new country was often used for rewriting their constitution without leaving home. So they could reinvent themselves and stay in the same place. And that was something that they continually did every time they found something wasn't working. They write that by the 1700s, petty kingdoms and pyramids had been entirely replaced by small towns with egalitarian clan structures and communal council houses. Women took on leadership roles. In the Asagi, the Nohozinga, or little old men, which included women, would be sent off to deliberate in the forest on nature and philosophy as it related to political issues. And what was common to all the cultures is that they were decidedly anti-authoritarian as a barrier against Cahokia, which now is completely even erased from their oral history. The lesson reached by Hedges is the more insurmountable the crisis becomes, the more like our prehistoric ancestors we'll retreat into self-defeating responses, violence, magical thinking, and denial. But that wasn't what happened. They moved to a new country by not fighting the old system, but building something new. As the Daves say, these freedoms were taken for granted by anyone who has not been specifically trained into obedience, as anyone reading their book, they say, has been. To put this together with David Graeber's book on debt, I think that money has reinforced 3,500 years of obedience training. And I think that phrase, blind obedience, actually has it backwards. What he shows in his book, and what I talk about in some episodes on money, is that coinage created taxation, and it forced everyone to participate in the conquest and enslavement of their neighbors and provide material support through food, armor, shelter, sex to the army so that they could get the coins to pay the tax so their own family didn't fall into slavery. That cognitive dissonance of doing something and seeing no other choice to preserve your own family, but knowing at some level that you're causing harm to others. That's something that we've been doing for 3,500 years. And what cognitive dissonance creates is this one idea, I'm a good person, and this other idea, I'm enabling violence. The end of that is that you stop seeing the violence. Or, if you're Chris Hedges, you see it and blame it on someone else. Chris doesn't see himself as falling into self-defeating responses, violence, and magical thinking and denial. He's ringing the bells of doom. Nothing self-defeating or magical about that. All of this brings me back to my Muskrat love for Kandiaronk. Who was he? He was a philosopher-statesman of the Wendat Confederacy. And what he was trying to do is play the English and the French off of each other while trying to form an indigenous alliance that could push back on the settler encroachment. He failed in that. He was described as Europeans as so naturally eloquent that they said no one perhaps ever exceeded him in mental capacity. He was the only man in Canada who was a match for the governor, who would invite him over for dinner and provoke him because his repartees, always animated, full of wit, were generally unanswerable. This is what Kandiaronk has to say about money. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls and slaughterhouse of the living. To imagine one can live in the country of money and preserve one's soul is like imagining one could live and preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Money is the father of luxury, lasciviousness, intrigues, trickery, lies, betrayal, insincerity, all of the world's worst behaviors. Fathers sell their children, husbands their wives, wives betray their husbands, brothers kill each other, friends are false, and all because of money. In the light of all this, tell me that we Wendat are not right in refusing to touch or so much as look at silver. Now, in Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari tells us, there is no way out of the imagined order. When we break down our prison walls and run towards freedom, we are in fact running into the more spacious exercise yard of a bigger prison. To which the Daves reply, nowadays most of us find it increasingly difficult to even picture what an alternative economic or social order would be like. Our distant ancestors seem, by contrast, to have moved regularly back and forth between them. If something did go wrong, terribly wrong, in human history, and given the current state of the world, it's hard to deny something did, then perhaps it began to go wrong precisely when people started losing that freedom to imagine and enact other forms of social existence. It all starts with imagining. For your imagining pleasure and rigor, here's Build a New Model that talks about 10 universal principles of system design. And then here's the one that I mentioned, Sex and Power, Battle of the Daves, that also talks about the dawn of everything. Thank you for watching all the way through, and please leave me a comment. I'm not hearing from some of my regulars, and I'm missing my reinvented society. Thank you.